Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey programme. Now, the former head of professional standards for the Australian government's offshore processing scheme in Nauru is a man named Oliver Laurence, and he joins me now in the studio. And Oliver, thank you so much for coming in, because I think a lot of people are absolutely fascinated with Australian policy, what was known as Operation Sovereign Borders under Tony Abbott. First of all, can you just explain what was your role in how that policy was delivered?
Yeah, so my role, in essence, was to support asylum seekers and refugees with complaints they made about the system we had in place. So Nauru was a very complex facility with a lot of infrastructure, and we had a lot of Australian expats there from Broad Spectrum, Wilson Security and Australian Border Force, looking after the care, the safety and security of asylum seekers and refugees. And my job was to respond to complaints they had and to implement additional policies where we thought we needed to provide additional care and support. And ultimately, if we did things wrong, hold our staff accountable.
Now, it's a fascinating case study, because when Tony Abbott became Prime Minister of Australia in 2013, he said he wanted to stop the boats. It was one of his big election slogans. And his policy was turn back. Against what some people would say was international law, to international condemnation, he turned boats back, tugged them back to Nauru. But I suppose there was a lot more to it than simply turning back the boats.
Hugely. You know, it was a very complex policy. In terms of 2013, came in with a primary mandate to turn back the boats and stop them. We were losing people at sea, and nobody wants to see men, women and children dying in the oceans off the Australian coast. So this policy came in 2013, Operation Sovereign Borders. We established Nauru and Manus Island as two of the processing centres, and the message was quite clear. If you want to make a trip on a boat to Australia and try to enter illegally, you will never get to arrive into Australia. You'll be sent to either Nauru and Manus Island, where your claims will then be processed, but you will never make Australian shore. It was incredibly complex. The infrastructure that was placed into both those remote areas was in the billions. And then on top of that, you've got the staff and the specialists supporting people with both medical concerns. You've then got the infrastructure behind education and social and welfare of these people, because we have to remember there are hundreds of millions of displaced people around the world. Australia recognised that, but equally they wanted people to come through a legitimate, lawful process in terms of applying through a third-party country.
So these enormous facilities that were established outside of mainland Australian territory, how many billions of Australian dollars are we talking, and what sort of infrastructure was running there?
So it was billions and billions. It was a huge commitment by the Australian government to make sure the policy was effective. And ultimately it worked. It stopped the boats. And so you're looking at sort of various different centres to support different cohorts, single adult females, families, single adult males. Everything was covered to make sure people's needs and expectations were met. And ultimately then you'd have a rotation of staff that would come in and off the island to make sure that care and support was provided 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And I had never worked with so many remarkably talented individuals supporting people who'd come from very, very distressing backgrounds.
There have been complaints about the conditions in these facilities. There have been many news stories that some of the conditions were not up to scratch, that there was illness, that all sorts of perhaps unpalatable things. Was that your experience?
No. Whenever you're implementing a policy of that size and scale and that complexity, there's always going to be problems along the way. There's no denying that at all. There were incidents of public disorder. People were frustrated with the system, frustrated with the process. So what we found is by having an open system, people could come and go from these centres as they pleased. They weren't prisons. They were provided with incredible accommodation. They often wouldn't allow our staff to go in and tend to them and support them, because obviously those that were really against the policy wanted to make sure that they could get out the images which would be graphic enough to demonstrate that this was bad and it was not in the interest of these individuals, when it was totally the opposite.
It's interesting, though, because it wasn't just about the idea of turning back the boats. These are processing facilities, and I suppose some of those who went through the processing facilities were determined to be genuine refugees. What lessons do we have to learn from that?
The key to the Australian policy, with several different segments, it was understanding that we needed a deterrent. Otherwise, people were going to continue to arrive into Australia. People then needed a lawful route to go through to be able to come to Australia, apply like other people do in terms of immigration. The number one job of government is to protect its borders. If we fundamentally can't get that right, we are in a serious pickle. And the British government has been grappling with this for a couple of years. And then you've got the piece around the enforcement and the investigation of the people smugglers. That that is where the efforts need to be focused so that the trade stops. So if people can see that it's going to be ineffective in getting on a boat, which isn't generally fit for purpose, overcrowded, not enough life jackets, etc., it's very dangerous. So the messaging was very clear too. Not only did we have this turn back the boat policy and we had Nauru and Manus Island, we had the communication structure to allow people to know that if you come here, if you make this attempt, you're not going to be successful and you're going to be processed through these third-party countries.
Interestingly, though, perhaps one of those strands that you just said, that the legal routes, the ability to apply lawfully, that's something that the Conservative Party doesn't seem to be exploring so much in this country. That sounds more like Labour Party policy.
We've got to be, I think, very mindful that at the moment, as of 2022, there are about 100 million displaced people around the world as a result of conflict and persecution. Some of that conflict we've been actively involved in, and there's a level of accountability on us as a Western nation, as in terms of the UK government in supporting some of these people try to find a place of safety. But they need a lawful route to do that. So I think we've got to find the happy medium in implementing a policy which shows a deterrent for those that wish to break the law and support those who wish to go through a process lawfully. And it's about trying to find that sort of relationship with the French and the Belgians and this European context. That's one thing Australia didn't have, the complexities of Europe. Australia was able to drive this policy because it had no real pushback from anyone other than some sort of very vocal charity groups. But the UK has Europe, which is not being overly supportive and not helpful in terms of designing a successful policy.
I wonder if that's where the comparisons therefore break down. Australia sort of had no rich, powerful countries in its immediate vicinity saying, no, you can't take boats back to here. It could sort of ride roughshod over the views and ideas of the countries around it in a way that perhaps we can't do with France without some pretty serious economic consequences.
Well, yeah, and I think with this and serious economic investment, you look at the Rwanda setup. Have we really researched, around that particular policy? At the moment, for me, it feels very band-aid. It feels to me like there's an election cycle coming, and we're going to put things into place quickly to show the electorate that we're doing something. But are we really doing something? Are we really making the bold decisions? Are we really making the bold moves? Because, as you said, under Rishi Sunak's premiership, 25,000 have arrived. He's only been in power a very short time. So clearly, the messaging that he's getting out is not working. You've got to be fair, firm and decisive with the policy. That is the key to success.
It is so interesting because the policies seem to have been so muddled coming out of the government. It seems like we get a different scheme or gimmick each week without that clear sense of direction. And I wonder, what is your view, as someone who worked at the heart of the Australian system, what is your view of the Rwanda scheme? Because a lot of people might think that this is offshore processing, when it's nothing of the sort.
No, it's just picking up a cohort of people that have tried to enter the country, dropping them off and wishing them the best of luck from what I can see. And I think if I was Suella Braverman, if I was the Prime Minister, I would be picking up the phone to people like Tony Abbott or the former head of Australian Border Force, Raymond Quadrig, and having conversations saying, how are you so successful about this? There's always going to be this huge divide as to whether people agree with it or not. But ultimately, if the experts are out there, if you found a policy which has been successful, albeit it was contentious and there were challenges, find the people that can help you design something which you can implement, which will be a success. And make sure that you don't have, we've just brought a barge on board. We've put a bunch of people on it. We've determined it's not safe for them to be on there. And we've taken them all off again. So it's a bit of a circus at the moment. We've really got to take the bull by the horns, reach out to the experts, ask for help, nothing wrong with that, and implement a policy which works.